Hi everyone. Here I'm going to engage in a very brief discussion or debate about who is the better basketball player between Dwight Howard in his prime, obviously, um, and a player like Anthony Davis, who is still in his prime, even though he's not as young and probably as quick as he used to be when he was in New Orleans. So when I look at basketball discourse overall, I always form my opinions based on the facts, right? I watch the games, I don't choose who is a better basketball players based on who I like more. Oftentimes, even when I'm making comparisons, I apply rigor and logic to my choice on who is a better player. I oftentimes end up arriving at the conclusion that doesn't fit who I like, who I enjoy the most as a basketball player. One such example is when I compared Kevin Durant with Kawhi Leonard. Kevin Durant is probably one of my favorite players to watch. I think he's an artist. He's like an artist on the basketball court. He's like he possesses a grace and artfulness in his game that very few players ever, particularly at the size we have ever seen. So, on the contrary, a player like a Kawhi that is more methodical or robotic, less fancy, um, I enjoy him a little bit less in terms of watchability, but I recognize through the use of my brain, through the use of logic, that yes, he is the better basketball player than Kevin Durant. He is more impactful in a 5-on-5 settings, and he gives you a better chance to win a title than Kevin Durant. So, as seen as in this example, oftentimes the best player doesn't necessarily mean who I enjoy most watching. I simply try to look at the situation in an unbiased way in order to arrive at the conclusion of who I think is the better basketball player. I did the same in my last video when I compared um, Kevin Garnett with Dirk Nowitzki. So now I want to engage, yes, as I stated in the intro, in the comparisons between Dwight and Anthony Davis. And when I look at basketball discourse surrounding Dwight, that is generally quite positive in terms of his game. Oftentimes, Dwight appears in the news because of his, I don't know, scandals, his off the court issues, and so forth. But generally, the discourse about Dwight as a basketball player is quite positive. It's about how undervalued, underrated he is, how he was nabbed from the top 75 list of the best players ever, um, and he was the most dominant center of his era. So generally, the basketball discourse about Dwight is quite good in what you see out there in the world, while the discourse about Anthony Davis is for the most part is negative. You know, the discourse about AD is that he's soft, he's always injured, which is true. Yes, he's always hurt. He's hurt quite a lot, but for the most part, most people don't like, for some reason, they don't like Anthony Davis, right? While while Dirk Nowitzki is, well, sorry, while Dwight Howard is held in a much better regard than him by comparison. So this is how people perceive these two players. One positively Dwight, one negatively AD as someone who was included in the top 75 list, even though he didn't deserve it according to most fans. So one of the two is, for the most part, disrespected in basketball discourse. That being Dwight. Sorry, that being AD. Now, I will give you my honest opinion on who is a better basketball player. And I'm not talking necessarily about who had a better career, who had the better, who is the most accomplished statistically all time, who scored more points all time, or who have better longevity. So I'm not discussing these accolades or accomplishments. For example, I often say that accolades have to be taken with a grain of salt, because you have players like Tim Duncan never won a Defensive Player of the Year, but Rudy Gobert won 3. Scottie Pippen never won a Defensive Player of the Year, but you have Dikembe Mutombo who won 3 or 4 times. So oftentimes, when distinguishing players, particularly defensive players, looking strictly at awards and accolades such as Defensive Player of the Year is not the best way to gauge how these players were impactful to winning, how good they were in their prime. So I'm not going to make a comparison of accolades, because honestly, if we are on this topic about accolades, I personally believe that AD should have won 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards. I believe he was snubbed at least a couple of times. In 2020, the year of the bubble, Anthony Davis was the reason why the Lakers had the best defense in the league. The year LeBron James joined the Lakers, they were not a good team by any means. Yes, LeBron missed a few games, and that partly explains why the Lakers missed the playoffs. But in 2020, Anthony Davis had one of the most impactful defensive seasons we've ever seen. AD goes there and immediately they become the number 1 defense in the league. And I personally believe he was snubbed from Defensive Player of the Year. The award was given to Giannis, partly due to how Giannis Antetokounmpo was a little bit, bolstered in the media talks as the guy who worked harder than anyone, who was the best defensive player in the league, even though I never believed that Giannis was the better defensive player in 2020. So I'm saying all of this just to say that I believe that if the discussion about these players is strictly narrowed down to accolades, then I will say that AD should have won at least 2 Defensive Players of the Year already. He is that great as a defensive player So the lack of accolades in that department for AD shouldn't be held against him, because he did his due to play as one of the best, if not the best defensive player in the league, and the fact he never won it shouldn't be used in these comparisons when comparing him to Dwight, who repeated as a Defensive Player of the Year. Now, I know that the discussions on Dwight has changed a lot over the years. Dwight was, initially, in my opinion, he was disrespected, because I believe his resume is much better than people who were listed in the top 75, such as Damian Lillard, who only made 1 conference finals in his career. Carmelo Anthony, didn't achieve what Dwight Howard achieved. Carmelo Anthony won 2 playoff series in his career in Denver, and if I'm not mistaken, he won 2 playoff series in his career in New York. I mean, Dwight Howard's tenure in Orlando alone, in my opinion, being a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, leading a team to the finals, that one alone is enough to put him ahead of a player like Carmelo Anthony or Damian Lillard in the top 75 list. So I truly believe that Dwight Howard, the year that the top 75 list was published, I truly believe that he was disrespected, truly, and he should have been in the list. However, I do believe that after this list came out, due to the people's reaction and the outcry against Dwight Howard's omission, I truly believe that Dwight Howard's career started getting a little bit romanticized. What do I mean by that? Is that I think that people started viewing Dwight much better, which is ironically, the top 75 list disrespected and degraded Dwight Howard's career, but on the contrary, it boosted his perception among the fans and even among the people who never watched him or people who watched him in his prime, but didn't really recall how he was perceived in his prime during his playing days when he was in Orlando. So I do believe the greatest irony is that Dwight Howard's reputation was indirectly boosted by the disrespect he received in the top 75 list in his omission, because now people tend to romanticize just a little bit Dwight Howard's career. They oftentimes rank him higher than he should be, in my opinion. Now, if you are asking me where do I believe Dwight Howard ranks all time as a center, for example, I would say he's a top 15 center ever. I wouldn't say he's top 10. I would say somewhere between 12 and 15 is quite fair. But when I'm talking about the issue of romanticization of Dwight, what do I mean? Dwight Howard, yes, he was the best center in the league by a mile in his playing days, particularly 2009, 2013. Those 5 years, Dwight Howard was hands down the best center in the league. Like, he had a stranglehold on the league as a big man that very few times we have seen in NBA history, right? So there's no disputing that. People who discuss him as being the best center of his era are not lying by any means. Now, where he ranked in the league overall, that is different in my opinion, because let's take the two best years spent in Dwight's career, right? 2009 to 2011, okay? Dwight, in my opinion, was the fifth or the sixth best player in the world, and not the second or third like many people are trying to suggest or imply in long after he played in his prime, like Stan Van Gundy did, like many players who were even Dwight's teammates are trying to do to bolster up his legacy. Now, in my opinion, these are the players who from 2009 and 2011 were better than Dwight. Kobe, I don't have to explain why. LeBron, D-Wade. D-Wade was second in MVP in 2009. Some people, including Michael Jordan at the time, believed that D-Wade should have won the MVP. He was that special, D-Wade. He was compared to Kobe before the Heatles were assembled. Then I have Dirk Nowitzki over Dwight Howard, because yes, Dirk wasn't in his prime anymore, 2009 to 2011. But what he did in the playoffs in 2011, being able to lead a franchise to the first championship ever, without really a reliable all-star teammate. He had good teammates, no doubt, players like J.J. Barea, an older Jason Kidd, but the way he performed, the way he was still able to impose his will in a playoff series, like he did against the OKC Thunder, the defending champion Lakers, against the Heatles. In my opinion, that is enough to have Dirk Nowitzki over AD in those years. So we have already four players, okay? We have LeBron, Kobe, D-Wade, and Dirk. Now, for the spot of the fifth best player in the league, in my opinion, it was between Chris Paul and Dwight Howard, 2009 to 2011. People forget, but Chris Paul was having one of the greatest primes by a point guard in NBA history. Only Magic, as a pure point guard, only Magic has an argument to have a better prime than prime Chris Paul. In 2008, when Kobe Bryant won the MVP, I was arguing back then that Chris Paul had an argument also to be the MVP. He had an incredible amount of assists, steals. He was running the point exceptionally, and an argument could be done. This depends on what do you value more, whether playmaking by a point guard or rim protection and rebounding by a big man, on what do you value more. But they were in the same tier, Chris Paul and Dwight Howard. Now, so based on these considerations, I believe that I believe that Dwight Howard was either the fifth, after Dirk Nowitzki was the fifth, or if you prefer Chris Paul, the sixth best player on the planet. What I will give credit to him, however, is that I believe that in terms of face of the league, if you're strictly talking about faces of the league, then he was number three behind Kobe and LeBron. Dwight in his prime had one of the biggest personalities in the game. He was charismatic, he was funny, he was always in NBA adverts. I remember the slam dunk dressed as a Superman with a cape where he jumped on a 12-foot rim. So Dwight Howard was one of the three most iconic basketball players of his era. More than Chris Paul, more than Dirk, and up there with Kobe and LeBron. So I'm not taking anything away from Dwight. I believe he impacted his era a lot, particularly as a face of the league, and he was the third face of the league. But as an overall basketball player, in my opinion, he was the fifth or the sixth best player in the league. Okay, so about the point that I made before, that after the list of top 75 lists came out, that people started romanticizing a little bit Dwight Howard more than he should be, is not because I don't think that Dwight Howard deserved to be respected. As I stated before, he ranks higher all time than Melo and Damian Lillard and many others, okay? And he's a top 15 center ever. However, the AD and Dwight comparisons is where I believe the biggest disconnect is between the people who follow hoops, right? And where the over-romanticization of Dwight occurs. So, in his playing days, Dwight Howard wasn't, when a basketball player is playing, people point out everything about him. What he does well, what he doesn't do well, his strengths, his weaknesses, and so forth. And it seems to me that after the top 75 list came out, nearly a decade after Dwight's prime, people seem to forget about the flaws that characterize Dwight Howard, right? People brush off all of that, and they only focus on his strengths, okay? Now, I will compare Dwight and AD's strengths and weaknesses, and here you will understand why I believe Anthony Davis is the better basketball player, okay? So let's talk about Dwight Howard's profile. What made Dwight Howard special? So let's talk about offense and defense. So let's start with the defense, okay? So Dwight Howard was known as an exceptional rim protector, one of the best we have ever seen in NBA history, right? His ability to anchor the paint, average close to 3 blocks a game in his prime, was really, really what stood out about his game. Dwight Howard definitely made his bread and butter in terms of reputation as being the best defensive anchor of his time, okay? So he was leading the league in rebounds and blocks multiple times. So this is what he provides defensively, okay? What does Dwight provide offensively? Dwight could average 20 a game just by his raw athleticism. Dwight in his prime is arguably a top 5 athlete we have ever seen in NBA history. As a raw athlete, I'm not saying as a basketball player, but in terms of raw athleticism. I would say that LeBron James, probably Shaq, probably, I'm trying to think, Blake Griffin, Prime Westbrook, these are the greatest athletes we have ever seen. And Dwight was every bit as good as them as a raw athlete, an absolute freak of nature. He was a better athlete than even Prime Giannis Antetokounmpo, just to say how absurd that is. So Dwight Howard really didn't have an offensive game. The way he averaged 20 was he didn't work on his game, but he was so physically dominant that he averaged 18 to 20 points sometimes 22 points a game, just by his raw athleticism. And what did Dwight used to do offensively? He was an exceptional lob threat, and so he was great at getting points by lobs, catching lobs, putbacks, and sometimes he had some semblance of a baby hook that he used to, as a drop step that he used to score. So Dwight Howard pretty much was a bad offensive player overall in terms of a first option as a scorer, but as a third, second, sometimes fourth option as a scorer, he was very, very, very good, because he could average 18, 20 points on 60% from the field just by his raw athletic ability, by catching lobs, by putbacks, and so forth. So here I examined his basketball profile, okay? But what are his weaknesses that people oftentimes overlook when discussing him in comparisons to AD? Number one, offensively. Dwight Howard cannot be the best offensive player, and in today's era in particularly, that is more offensive oriented, I'm not sure that Dwight can be the number 2 offensive player on your championship team. Why? Because Dwight Howard's game was so limited, and the final series against the Lakers in '09 proved why he was quite flawed as an offensive player. Because besides lobs, putbacks, which if you have a good coach you can scheme against in a playoff series, Dwight didn't provide much of anything offensively. He couldn't shoot the three, the mid-range. He didn't have a reliable post-game. Dwight Howard couldn't dribble to save his life, and he couldn't pass at all. Now, I'm not holding Dwight to a higher comparison than he should be. So I'm not lamenting Dwight's lack of offensive prowess in comparison to the unicorns of today, like a Joel Embiid and a Nikola Jokic. So when I'm saying that Dwight is not a good passer, he's not a good ball handling, I'm not expecting him to be a 6'10 guard at all, right? So I don't think that in this comparison I'm holding him to a different standard. So I'm comparing him to a traditional center, like a Patrick Ewing, a David Robinson, and so forth. So Dwight Howard's game is very limited, even compared to a center. So let's talk about passing, right? By passing, I'm not saying that I'm expecting Dwight to average 8, 10 assists a game like a Nikola Jokic. I'm not saying something like that. What I'm saying is that if you compare him to most great centers, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Shaquille O'Neal, all of those players could pass out of the double teams. And that becomes important in the playoffs when teams load up on you. And Dwight Howard really was a bad passer. While players like Shaq, like Russell, Kareem, traditional centers usually were adept at passing, unlike Dwight. So this is a big flaw in Dwight's game, placing out of double teams. Number 2, Dwight Howard couldn't shoot and didn't have a great post game, okay? So he was not a threat to score anywhere else other than under the basket, which in the playoffs make him very easy to scout against and to scheme against, as Phil Jackson proved in the 2009 NBA Finals when they faced the Orlando Magic. So, as I stated before, so he's not a threat to shoot anywhere, right? He cannot pass really out of double teams. He didn't have a post game. So the only thing that kept his scoring efficiency, scoring production alive was his athletic ability to catch lobs and putbacks, right? But other than that, he didn't have anything to give. Now let's compare him to Anthony Davis, okay? If I'm a coach and I have to scheme against Anthony Davis in a playoff series to beat his team, it will be much, much harder than comparing to Dwight. Why? Because Anthony Davis, while not being an exceptional offensive player like a Joel Embiid or a Nikola Jokic or a Shaquille O'Neal, he's still very impactful and versatile enough to make it very difficult to go against him in a playoff series if I'm scheming against him. Because unlike Dwight, uh, a player like Anthony Davis is a threat to score 30 a game. He could score 30 a game as he multiple times or even throughout the whole playoff series, like he showed, for example, in 2020 in the bubble, in 2018 when he scored 30 points against the Warriors, 2015 he averaged 30 a game against the Warriors, who won the championship that year, in 2018 against the Portland Trail Blazers he averaged 30 plus a game. So Anthony Davis is a threat to score, and he can get 30 games. So this creates much, much more pressure on a defense than Dwight Howard does, because Anthony Davis has a very versatile game. I'm not saying he's a great passer or an exceptional passer, but Anthony Davis' basketball IQ is high enough that he can recognize the double team, and if he's stuck in the paint with players loading up on him, he knows how to act or to whom to pass, unlike a player like Dwight, number one. Number two, you cannot do the heck a Dwight or the heck a Shaq to a player like AD, because AD is going to knock his free throw. On the other hand, resorting to heck a Dwight against AD is like a death sentence, because he's going to make almost every free throw. Then his game is more unpredictable. You're not going to know if AD is going to go for the mid-range shot, if he's going to go in the post, in the pocket. And so all of the weapons that a player like AD has make him a much more dangerous cover than a player like Dwight. And this is part of the reason why I think Anthony Davis is the better player between the two. And then what's the other thing about Dwight, right? Dwight is arguably one of the GOAT's lob threat players, right? His athletic ability to catch lobs in difficult situations when the point guard passes at him. And you know what's the interesting thing? Anthony Davis is exceptional as a lob threat player. So Dwight's biggest strength offensively among all players to ever live is arguably one of AD's greatest strengths, being one of the three greatest lob threat player ever. So I don't see any single argument you can make that offensively Dwight is better than AD. He doesn't shoot better, he doesn't have a better post game, he doesn't pass better, he cannot dribble the ball. And these are very important things, because if Dwight cannot dribble the ball, it means that in a playoff setting you simply have to shield the point guard. So the point guard cannot pass the ball to Dwight, and so if you protected the ball from the point guard, you can make a much better job at guarding Dwight Howard and rendering him ineffective in a playoff series. But you cannot do the same thing to Anthony Davis, because even let's say New Orleans Pelicans Anthony Davis, okay? Let's say that you want to avoid the pass that he receives from the point guard, like a Rajon Rondo, okay? Then you have to worry about Anthony Davis taking the ball up the court and going to score. So the fact that a player like Anthony Davis can dribble the ball, handle the ball, and it makes it a much harder to cover than a player that has zero ball handling ability like a Dwight Howard. and another point I want to make is this. So it is true that in the 2009 NBA Finals, okay, Dwight Howard, who is regarded as an unstoppable athlete, okay, he was held under 15 a game by the Los Angeles Lakers. Now, I'm not saying that if you put Anthony Davis in Dwight's place, that the Orlando Magic are winning the championship. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, it will um, make it much more difficult to beat them, because I don't think that even with great defense, you can hold a prime Anthony Davis under 27 points a game, at worst 26 points a game. You know, when when um, when Anthony Davis was let's say defended by some of the best defenders of his era, like Draymond Green, Draymond could never hold Anthony Davis under 30 points a game in a series. So even accounting for a different pace, a different style of basketball played in 2009 compared to 2020s, I still believe Anthony Davis, with his vast arrays of moves, is still able to get at least 25 points a game in the NBA Finals against the Lakers. So the fact that Dwight, as one of the most efficient scorers, due to him having a limited game and catching lobs, couldn't cross the 15-point mark against the Lakers, which was a very good defense, I don't think you can make an argument that he's a better basketball player than Anthony Davis at all. So now that I covered the offense, let's talk about the defense. So Dwight Howard was the best rim protector and rebounder of his age. So let's say that Dwight is a 10 out of 10 as a rim protector and rebounder. Then what is Anthony Davis on a scale 1 to 10? 9.5. So the gap between them defensively isn't as strong to justify having Dwight over AD. Because AD has shown in multiple series, like in 2023, against the Memphis Grizzlies, against the Golden State Warriors, that he can shut down a higher, more complex offensive systems than the ones that Dwight has faced in his playoff career, such as the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Atlanta Hawks, and teams of that caliber. Anthony Davis' ability, in my opinion, as a defender overall is even greater or as good as prime Dwight Howard. Yes, Dwight Howard has a slight edge as a rim protector, but Dwight didn't have to face the coverages, the offensive players, the perimeter guards that a player like AD is facing every single time. Dwight didn't have to be switched on the best perimeter players. If you look at the 2009 series against the Cavs that the Orlando Magic won, it wasn't because of Dwight necessarily. It was because they ran a better offensive scheme, a much better offensive scheme based on three-point shooting than the Cavs were running. And it wasn't because of Dwight's the best defensive player in the world. That's the reason why they won the series. It's not because of that, because he couldn't shut down LeBron from averaging almost 40 a game in the playoff series. On the other hand, a player like AD has the ability to be switched on any perimeter player. We've seen him guard Stephen Curry in this series in 2023. We saw him guard Damian Lillard in the bubble, taking assignment of guarding Jimmy Butler in the bubble. So to me, Anthony Davis, overall, even if you give a slight edge as a rim protector to Dwight, and Dwight is a 10 out of 10, and AD is a 9.5 out of 10, the ability that Anthony Davis has to affect the perimeter, which is 50 times greater than Dwight, in my opinion, gives him an edge, even on the defensive end. So we determined that if AD is a better defensive player overall, if he's a much better offensive player overall, and if he's overall a better teammate from a standpoint of being of bringing less drama in the locker room than Dwight did in his prime, then this by conclusion make Anthony Davis a better basketball player than even prime Dwight Howard. Now, for the people wondering or arguing, Dwight Howard is better because he led the team in the finals while Anthony Davis without LeBron never did so. I would respond this way. Do you believe that the Western Conference where Anthony Davis played when he was in New Orleans, where he oftentimes missed the playoffs, do you believe that that conference, don't you believe that that conference is way, 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 way better than the East that Dwight dominated? When Dwight Howard was dominating the East, you had only two good teams, the Boston Celtics and the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Detroit Pistons were already old and past their prime. When Anthony Davis was playing in the West, you had so many strong teams. And so I don't think that Anthony Davis is missing the playoffs if he played in the East where Dwight dominated. And secondly, you have to also look at the rosters both players had in comparisons to their competition. For example, it is true that AD played with great players in NOLA, for example, in New Orleans, such as young Drew Holiday, I think Eric Gordon, Nikola Mirotic, Julius Randle for half a year, but he never had all of them at the same time in their prime. Some years he had a few of these players, Rajon Rondo including, some years he had others, DeMarcus Cousins. He never had all of them at the same time. And the roster that Dwight had in 2009, Jameer Nelson, Rashard Lewis, Hideo Turkoglu, even though they're not big names, by comparison to the competition in their conference of the Eastern Conference in 2009, is much greater overall, in my opinion. So overall, I would say that even though the names that AD played with seem much better than the players, than the names that Dwight played with, I have to point that contextualizing the eras and the amount of talent that there is in the 2020s compared in 2009 make the comparisons of the roster not a good point in favor of Dwight, in my opinion, because the conference where he played in the East was way, way weaker than the conference that AD dominated in his career in New Orleans. So for all of these reasons, I cannot really make an argument that Dwight Howard was a better basketball player than Anthony Davis. I could make the argument that he was more durable and he was more athletically dominant. But I cannot make an argument that if I'm scouting against them in a playoff series, that I'm taking Dwight over Anthony Davis. It's really hard to make that argument unless you want to engage or be victim of nostalgia, which unfortunately many NBA fans today are. Now, this isn't to say that I don't love Dwight. I love his game, and I believe he's a top 15 center ever. But what Anthony Davis gives you to a team and how versatile it is, it's something that very few players in NBA history can give you.